the change in the book on this edition is actually quite an important one. That's why this launch is happening. It's changed from a book on risk and reliability and risk management to a book on engineering due diligence. Now that's actually quite a big change, and it's worthwhile explaining why that change exists and why it needs to exist and what the change is. Because it's going to change the way the whole risk management business is done in Australia, so far as I can tell. And so far as I can tell, most of the people it's going to affect, it hasn't hit them yet. Now, I'll just run through a couple of points as to why that's the case. Firstly, one of the reasons is because the meaning of the word risk management has changed rather violently over the last 20 years. When risk management first turned up, it was all about insurance and insurance risk management. And that's all about downside risk. Okay, that means people were talking about fires and floods and cyclones and things that collapsed and all that sort of thing. But when you're optimising risk, you were talking about the management of downside risk. Now the risk management standards popped up. Well, it may not be the only reason, but it's one of the reasons. And the risk management concept, if you like, became commercialised. And that means the commercial people talked about upside risk and downside risk simultaneously. So when they used the word risk management, what they mean is how do you optimise the outcome, taking into account both upside and downside risk simultaneously. That brings out the idea of risk appetite, because you're trying to say if I take more chances, then I will get more reward. And you can trade these things off. I've got to point out though, when it comes to risk appetite and downside or safety risk, very few people have risk appetite. It doesn't really exist. So the meaning of the word risk management has changed quite significantly in a 20-25 year period. And so whereas I used to actually do risk management, in the last 10 or so years, it's really been about due diligence, which is what the management of downside risk is all about. That leads you on to the second point, which is the formal incorporation of due diligence into the Model Work Health and Safety Act. Now, that concept of due diligence is a wholly legal concept, okay? You don't do due diligence with the laws of nature, you deal with the laws of man when you talk about due diligence. And so when they require due diligence to be positively demonstrated by senior decision makers, that adds a complexity to most people's lives. I can remember giving a presentation with Barry Sheriff, who was one of the lawyers who helped draft the legislation. It was in front of a whole, couple hundred engineers somewhere in Sydney. And I just made a passing remark because I thought it was perfectly obvious that if you want to be safe, managing the laws of nature is logically prior to managing the laws of man. Now, I just always assumed that was so obvious it was embarrassing, but when you talk to the lawyers as a group, that's not necessarily true. The concept of due diligence is a legal concept, yes. It used to apply as a defence against negligence in the common law, and that comes from, if you care about these things, Donoghue versus Stevenson and the majority decision, particularly well articulated by Lord Atkin in 1932. If you have to demonstrate due diligence, and the common law has been always quite clear about this, and the courts have always been quite clear about this since that time as to how you would go about doing it. There's basically, we call it a Y model at R2A, but basically the principles are fairly obvious. You've got to establish what all the key critical things you want to worry about are. You need a completeness argument. For each one of those key critical issues, you've got to establish what the practical precautions are, those things which could be done practically within the laws of nature that you know could be achieved. Then you have to demonstrate which one of those precautions is reasonable, and then you reasonably practicable, and then you go away and do it. Which brings us on to the issue of hazard-based versus precaution-based risk assessment, which is the heart of this due diligence thing. From a legal point of view, if you follow the standard way of going about risk management, which is encouraged by the risk management standard and most of the technical processes and most of the technical standards, what you normally do is you establish the hazard first. You say, right, here's my issue. You then characterise the risk associated with this thing, likelihood and consequence. You then compare that to criteria in some way. If you don't satisfy your risk criteria, you then say, well, that's not good enough. I'll put more precautions in until I do. And once you've satisfied your criteria, you say you've achieved it. That process was never able to satisfy common law due diligence. And the reason is like this. Suppose you're talking about something that's very nasty, but very rare. The things that kill people typically, right? If you follow that process, that risk management standard process, you'll say the likelihood of killing somebody, say, is 1 by 10 to the minus, whatever it is, 6. If you haven't achieved your target, you put more precautions in until you do. And once you have achieved that, you say, right, away we go. Now, if that analysis was repeatable and scientific, that event won't happen in your lifetime. The problem is, of course, sometimes they do. And then you wind up in court. The court is absolutely crystal clear about this. They do not care how many times it went well. The courts are absolutely crystal clear. They describe themselves as hindsight biased. They do not care how many times it went well. By definition, they only look at the time that it went badly. The rare time it wasn't supposed to, but it did. What actually happens in court, and the only time that they actually use the concept of risk management, is when the court tests, when all the expert witnesses pop up after the event and say what it is that could have been done. If it had been done, would have stopped it going wrong. But being an expert in hindsight is actually not that hard. If you've ever tried it, it's pretty bloody obvious what could have been done. If it had been done, would have stopped it going wrong. The only time when the notion of risk pops up in court is when the court is tested to see whether the ideas dreamed up by the experts after the event were sensible in view of what was known at the time. But that is a precaution-based process. It is not a hazard-based process, which the risk management standard encourages you to take. In short, if you adopt a hazard-based approach to risk, and that's all you do, and I've got to say fairly that most people who've been doing that sort of thing throw a few other processes on top of it now, which is why they've got a chance of being diligent. But if you truly adopted just a hazard-based approach to risk, so far as I can tell, by definition, you cannot be diligent. What actually happens in life these days is that people are actually accepting us to do work using the precaution-based approach to risk. We immediately strike the incumbent risk and audit department, and all hell breaks loose. Because it's not what they're doing, and it's a paradigm shift.